Hello, my name is David, and today I'm gonna talk about why social networking sites have no liability when an entity uses their platforms to assist in staging a violent protest in which there can be a loss of life. For this debate, I'm gonna talk about three different aspects. The first one is my posture about why these social media platforms do not need to be held responsible for the consequences of the individuals who are using the platforms. Also, I'm going to talk about a counter argument about why this is the best option, and I consider that the perspective of how social networking sites should not be held liable is the best. And finally, we're going to talk about some cases regarding the US riot capital. Firsthand, Section 230 of the United States Code of the Communication Decency Act protects social networking sites from liability for user-generated content. What this means is basically social media platforms have absolute immunity under Section 230. Well, not absolute, but we're gonna talk about later on how these terms can apply for some cases, such as the US riot capital, or sometimes in which not, in the case of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal. This section 230 can be found in Title 47, which talks generally about telecommunications. And this was established, or it is part of the Communication Act Decency, as we mentioned before, of 1996. Basically, during this period, internet was starting to be something global, was starting to be something really popular that everybody was using nowadays across the world, and they needed some regulations, but most of it they needed law. They needed order to protect both social media companies or general telecommunication companies and the users that are using those platforms, of course. And according to an article made from Goldman, he states that under this section, websites are not legally responsible for third-party content. And internet, basically, as we know today, is shaped by the legal foundations of this section, which leads us to the next point, which is how censoring content regarding protests or of any other type restricts freedom of expression. If we start putting the blame to these platforms, then we're misusing or we're misunderstanding who's to blame for who, of course. In this case, what we're saying is we have a group who's staging a violent protest which can possibly lead to a possible death of no matter what type, or maybe later after that protest happens, and we're blaming the social platforms. This is no good because they haven't done anything with respect to that. And if they start to be held liable about this, then that means there must be some rules for censorship. In this case, this would be completely against the principles of any social media platform. I call it Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, etc, etc. And why? Generally because we have the First Amendment talking about freedom of speech, and Section 230 is really linked to this by the means that they protect websites about publishing, editing, or removing third-party content that in offline situations would normally dictate the publisher's liability on assisting with the staging of a violent protest. In this case, for example, if we have a newspaper and start publishing about, a protest, then it could be held liable because they're the ones publishing. But in this case, social media, they don't have the control over there, and they cannot control which things can be posted or not, because billions of posts are made daily, and it would be really, really hard. And you also have to realize that they're already doing that. Only thing is that an entire planet is posting every day in more than probably 20 social platforms. It would be impossible for them to try to control these things. Now we're going to talk about Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal and why this is not related to our topic. Some people may confuse to what happened to Facebook during the presidential elections between President Donald Trump and candidate Hillary Clinton because during that case, Facebook was held accountable due to mishandling in data privacy regarding the Cambridge Analytica case, where a third party was gathering information from users from Facebook to then start posting in their feeds things related that could support Donald Trump, and therefore there could be an increase in potential voters for Donald Trump. This case liability was applied because the platform's own negligence, and not because of speech liability. What we're talking right now is why social media platforms should not be held liable when users use those platforms to gather or start some protests. There's an example of this when the Capitol riot happened. Actually, in January 6th of 2021, the US Capitol was attacked by a crowd in the attempt to stop a joint session of the Congress from certifying the electoral votes of the 2020 presidential elections. And during this attempt, there were several deaths, including 4 suicides of people who was involved during the protests, whether it could be protestants or officers that were there trying to stop the situation. And there was also death during the riot from the Air Force veteran person named Ashley Babbitt of age 35, who died after being shot in the shoulder by a Capitol protester. In this case, several lawsuits were filed by Capitol police officers and other parties against social media companies. The main ones involved were Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, etc. And the main cause of the lawsuit was because it was said that the platforms facilitated extremist content, allowing protestants to plan, gather together, and incite violence. However, as we mentioned before, under the rules of Section 230, all these lawsuits in the end were put to a stop, and in the final report, they said that all the social media platforms had nothing to do with it. Why? Well, the reason why social media role was left out mainly was because of they are not interpreted as the publisher. They don't have the authority to control all the posts and all the things that these protesters and these users were doing at the moment. Also, prohibiting the access of making those protesters talk or use their platforms would indicate that they would prohibit also the freedom of speech. And from this, the Capitol riot, we can learn that it's different from Facebook Cambridge because first, during the Facebook Cambridge Analytical case, it happened because, as we said, data privacy was mishandled. But in this case, there was no responsibility held from social media because they had nothing to do with it. And as always, it is important to remember that all of this is sustained by Section 230 that can be found in the United States Code during the Title 47. Thanks so much.